The sun rises slowly over ancient Athens, its light sliding across marble floors, still cool from the night. Inside the gymnasium, the air is thick with sweat and oil. Bare feet scrape against stone. Young bodies stand exposed, inspected, measured, evaluated. There are no chains, no screams, only silence. You are told this is education. You are told this is honor. A boy barely past childhood lowers his eyes as an older man studies him with calm authority. Around them, no one intervenes. No one questions. This moment is not hidden in shadows. It exists in the open, protected by law, tradition, and philosophy. Here, desire is not a secret. It is a system. History teaches you to admire ancient Greece as the birthplace of democracy, reason, and beauty. But beneath the columns and ideals, another lesson was being taught with the human body itself. Can you imagine growing up in a world where violation wears the mask of virtue? And if this was called civilization, what was left for those without a voice? To understand what unfolded in spaces like the gymnasium, you must step into the logic of ancient Greece itself, not as a land of timeless ideals, but as a rigid social hierarchy disguised as harmony. Athens in the 5th century BCE called itself a democracy, yet that promise applied to only a narrow class, adult male citizens. Everyone else existed on the margins of that ideal. Women were excluded from political life and confined to domestic spaces. Enslaved people were considered property, their bodies tools of labor. Children and adolescents occupied an ambiguous zone, valued not for who they were, but for who they might become. Greek society did not view the individual as sacred. It viewed the role as sacred. Sexual norms followed the same structure. Desire was not defined by orientation, affection, or consent as understood today. Instead, it was governed by status. The critical question was never whom one desired, but who held power. To act was noble. To be acted upon was shameful. This distinction shaped law, custom, and reputation. Philosophers debated virtue and self-control, yet rarely questioned the system itself. Plato wrote of love as a path to wisdom. Aristotle described household order as a natural hierarchy. Their words helped address power in the language of reason. What appears to modern eyes as contradiction was to them coherence. Popular history celebrates Greek sculpture, theater, and democratic debate. School books linger on marble statues and noble speeches, but they often glide past the quieter reality, a society where bodies were ranked, observed, and disciplined long before they were understood as belonging to themselves. You are taught to see ancient Greece as the beginning of Western moral thought, yet morality here did not protect the vulnerable. It organized them. So when historians describe certain practices as accepted or educational, a deeper question must be asked. Accepted by whom and at what cost? And what happens when a civilization's highest ideals are built on the silence of those who could not speak? In ancient Greece, sexuality was never a private matter. It was a language of dominance, a code through which society taught every citizen where they stood. To modern eyes, this world appears chaotic, permissive, even contradictory. But within its own logic, it was brutally consistent. The Greeks did not divide desire into categories such as heterosexual or homosexual. Those distinctions meant nothing to them. What mattered was position. Who penetrated and who was penetrated, who commanded and who submitted. Sexual acts were not judged by the gender of the participants, but by the balance of power between them. An adult male citizen was expected to be active. Control over one's own body and over others' bodies was proof of virtue and masculinity. To desire was acceptable. To yield was not. This is why the same act could be praised in one context and condemned in another. A man who dominated was respected. A man who allowed himself to be dominated lost honor, status, and the right to speak as an equal. This logic extended beyond sex. It mirrored the structure of the household, the city, and the state. The citizen ruled his wife. He ruled his children. He ruled his slaves. Sexual access followed the same hierarchy. Consent, as a moral category, did not exist in the way you understand it today. Obligation replaced it. Tradition justified it. Silence enforced it. You might ask yourself where pleasure fits into this system. The answer is unsettling. Pleasure belonged to those at the top. For those below, the experience was framed as duty, education, or inevitability. The body became a classroom. The act became a lesson. Resistance, when it appeared, was dismissed as immaturity or shame. Public spaces reinforced this order. The gymnasium was not merely a place of exercise. It was where boys were shaped into men, both physically and socially. Nakedness was normal, even celebrated, but it was not neutral. Every glance carried meaning. Every posture was evaluated. The body was displayed not for freedom, but for scrutiny. Literature and art reflect this worldview with disturbing clarity. Vase paintings show scenes of pursuit and submission rendered without outrage. Comedies joke about conquest. Philosophical dialogues discuss love while quietly assuming inequality. What is absent is often more revealing than what is shown. You rarely hear the voice of the one being observed. You almost never hear refusal. From the outside, this system presents itself as orderly, rational, even beautiful. From within, it trains individuals to accept their place before they are old enough to question it. The lesson is learned early. Power grants desire, legitimacy. Lack of power turns desire into obligation. This is the foundation upon which more specific practices were built. Without this hierarchy, those practices would collapse under moral scrutiny. With it, they became tradition. And once a tradition is sanctified by philosophy, law, and custom, how do you challenge it? How does a child argue against a civilization? As you move deeper into this world, the question is no longer whether these practices existed. It is why they were protected, and why, for centuries, they were remembered not as cruelty, but as culture. In ancient Greece, there was a word that carried the weight of honor, mentorship, and desire all at once: paiderastia. To its defenders, it described a noble bond between an adult man and a boy, on the threshold of adulthood. To modern ears, the word itself already sounds like an alarm. But within Greek society, it was not whispered. It was discussed openly, regulated carefully, and defended passionately. The older man, the Erastes, was expected to guide, protect, and educate. He taught the boy how to speak, how to fight, how to carry himself as a future citizen. In return, the younger one, the Eromenos, offered admiration, loyalty, and his body. This exchange was framed as mutual benefit. Wisdom flowed downward. Honor flowed upward. Desire was woven quietly into the arrangement. You are told this was not abuse. You are told there were rules. The boy was to resist just enough to appear virtuous. The man was to pursue without seeming desperate. Too much eagerness from the youth meant shame. Too much submission marked him as weak. The ritual demanded performance from both sides, a carefully balanced choreography where refusal was symbolic and consent was implied by silence. Imagine being that boy, not yet a man, not yet allowed a voice in the assembly, raised in a world where every adult tells you this attention is a privilege, that to be chosen is to be honored, that discomfort is confusion, and confusion is ignorance. You learn quickly what is expected of you. You learn faster what happens to those who fail. Public opinion enforced these rules with cruelty disguised as humor. Plays mocked boys who accepted gifts too eagerly. Poets praised restraint while eroticizing youth. Reputation mattered more than feeling. What happened in private was less important than how it appeared in public. Pain, if it existed, was irrelevant. Silence preserved dignity. Philosophers attempted to cleanse the practice by elevating it. Plato wrote of love that ascends from the body to the soul, from desire to truth. In theory, the physical act was secondary. In reality, the hierarchy remained. The boy's body was still the gateway through which education passed. His personhood was postponed until maturity, but his availability was immediate. Sparta offers a harsher variation. There, the bond between older warriors and boys was tied directly to military discipline. Endurance was praised. Emotion was weakness. The body was trained to obey long before the mind could question. Desire and violence existed side by side, indistinguishable in their function. Both produced loyalty. Both reinforced obedience. Defenders of these practices often argue that Greek boys eventually grew into powerful men themselves, that the cycle continued, that no one was permanently harmed. But this argument assumes harm only exists when it leaves visible scars. It ignores what happens when a society teaches its children that their value lies in how well they endure. You are asked to believe this system produced great thinkers, brave soldiers, enlightened citizens. And it did. But at what cost? How many learned early that resistance was futile? How many internalized the lesson that power justifies desire? What makes this practice truly unsettling is not its existence, but its normalization. It was not hidden in shadows. It was regulated, debated, and praised. It lived comfortably alongside philosophy and art. It was civilization teaching itself where the line was drawn and who was never allowed to cross it. If education requires silence, can it still be called guidance? If honor demands submission, whose honor is being protected? And if an entire society agrees on a lie, does it stop being one? These questions linger unanswered as you turn to those who were excluded even further from voice and choice. Because if boys were taught to endure, women were taught to disappear. If boys in ancient Greece were trained to endure, women were trained to vanish. From birth, a woman's body was not considered her own. It belonged first to her father, then to her husband, and ultimately to the household as a unit of production and legitimacy. While men moved freely through public spaces debating philosophy and law, women lived behind walls, in the gynoeceum, a domestic world designed to be unseen. You are often told that Greek women were protected, that their isolation preserved honor, but protection is only protection when it can be refused. In Athens, a respectable woman did not walk the streets alone. She did not attend symposia. She did not choose her partner. Her virtue was measured by absence. The less she was seen, the more she was praised. Sexuality followed the same logic of control. A woman's desire was irrelevant, dangerous even. Medical texts described female passion as chaotic and destabilizing, something that had to be restrained for the good of the household. Marriage was not a union of affection. It was a contract of reproduction. The female body existed to produce legitimate heirs, nothing more. Consider the imbalance this created. Men were encouraged to explore desire outside marriage. Women were condemned for even the suspicion of it. Adultery for a woman was a crime against the state, not because of betrayal, but because it threatened bloodlines and inheritance. A husband who discovered his wife's infidelity was legally permitted to punish her partner severely. The woman herself rarely spoke in her own defense. The law did not expect her to. Silence was not just social, it was enforced by ritual and routine. Young women were married soon after puberty, often to men decades older. The transition from girlhood to wifehood happened abruptly, without ceremony meant for her benefit. There was no education in desire, only instruction in obedience. Pain, confusion, fear, these were not topics for discussion. They were assumed to be part of duty. Sparta presents a different image, often misinterpreted as freedom. Spartan women exercised, owned property, and spoke more openly. Yet even here, autonomy had limits. Their bodies were valued for strength and fertility. Sexuality served the state's obsession with producing warriors. Choice existed only insofar as it aligned with national survival. What is most striking is not how little women appear in historical records, but how deliberately they were erased. Their voices survive only in fragments, a line of poetry, a passing reference, a moral warning. Male authors described women as temptations, vessels, or threats, rarely as minds. Art mirrors this absence. Female bodies appear in sculpture and pottery, idealized and silent, perfect forms without interiority. Desire projected onto them, never spoken from within. The woman is looked at, never the one who looks back. You might wonder how an entire civilization normalized this disappearance. The answer lies in how power defines normality. When law, philosophy, and religion all agree that a group should not speak, silence begins to feel natural, even inevitable. But silence leaves traces. It lingers in the anxiety surrounding female purity, in the obsessive control of movement and appearance, in the fear that if women were allowed desire, the entire structure would collapse. Ask yourself what kind of society requires half its population to be invisible in order to function. What kind of order depends on silence to survive? The Greeks gave the world the language of reason, but reason, when separated from empathy, becomes a tool. And when that tool is turned toward the body, it does not need chains. It needs only rules. As you move forward, another question emerges. If boys were disciplined and women erased, how did the Greeks reconcile these practices with the divine? The answer lies with their gods, beings who desired freely, violently, without consequence. And when gods behave without restraint, what message does that send to those who worship them? To the ancient Greeks, the gods were not moral guides in the modern sense. They were mirrors, reflections of human impulse magnified by immortality and power. Where mortals were constrained by law and reputation, the gods acted without consequence. And in their actions, the Greeks found justification. Zeus desired relentlessly. He transformed himself into animals, strangers, shadows, anything required to reach the bodies he wanted. Apollo pursued youth with obsession. Poseidon took by force. These stories were not cautionary tales. They were foundational myths, told to children, celebrated in art, preserved in poetry. Divine desire was not restrained. It was inevitable. You are told these myths are symbolic, allegories of nature, power, creation, but symbols still teach. When a civilization's highest beings ignore consent, what lesson filters down to those who live beneath them? The gods did not ask permission. They took, and the world continued. Rituals reinforced this worldview. Festivals dedicated to Dionysus blurred boundaries between order and chaos. Wine flowed. Masks erased identity. Sexual acts were performed publicly or implied openly, not as scandal, but as sacred release. Desire was worship. Excess was devotion. In these moments, restraint was not virtue. Surrender was. For those in power, this provided a release valve, a way to temporarily suspend social rules while keeping the hierarchy intact. For those without power, it offered no protection. Sacred space did not equal safe space. When desire is sanctified, refusal becomes blasphemy. Consider the role of temples and priesthoods. While not identical to later religious institutions, they still wielded authority over bodies and behavior. Certain individuals were chosen, dedicated, set apart. Their sexuality was regulated, redirected, or ritualized. The language was spiritual. The effect was control. The Greeks did not separate religion from daily life. The divine permeated everything. This meant that sexual norms were not merely social expectations, they were cosmological truths. To challenge them was not only to defy custom, but to defy the order of the universe itself. Ask yourself how difficult resistance becomes under those conditions. How does a boy question a practice praised by philosophers and echoed in myth? How does a woman assert autonomy when even the gods deny it? When power claims divine precedent, silence becomes survival. Art once again plays its role. Vase paintings depict gods pursuing mortals with calm inevitability. Sculptures freeze moments of desire without consequence. Beauty anesthetizes violence. The viewer is invited to admire, not to question. Over time, repetition dulls discomfort. What once disturbed becomes familiar. What becomes familiar becomes normal. This is how systems endure, not through constant force, but through narrative. Through stories told so often they feel like truth. The Greeks did not invent oppression, but they perfected its aesthetic. They taught the world how to make power look beautiful. By now, a pattern has emerged. Sexuality in ancient Greece was not chaotic freedom. It was organized imbalance. Boys were shaped through endurance. Women were erased through silence. Desire was justified through divinity. Each layer supported the next. And when later civilizations inherited Greek philosophy, art, and myth, they did not inherit them empty. They carried these assumptions forward, sometimes unconsciously. The idea that power legitimizes desire did not die with the temples. It evolved. So the question is no longer confined to the ancient world. It reaches toward you, toward the present, toward the tradition still defended because it has always been this way. If gods can take without asking, why shouldn't men? If ritual excuses harm, who decides where sacred ends and abuse begins? And if beauty can disguise cruelty, how many systems survive because they look enlightened from a distance? These questions linger as the ancient world fades, but their echoes remain because history does not stay buried. It waits to be repeated or understood. From a distance, ancient Greece appears luminous. White marble, balanced proportions, rational debate. It is easy to believe that a civilization capable of such beauty must also have been humane, but comparison exposes the illusion. When placed beside other historical systems of control, Greek practices do not appear unique. They appear refined. In the Ottoman harem, control was overt, enforced by walls, guards, and ritualized surveillance. In Renaissance courts, women were traded through marriage contracts, their bodies inspected for political value. In ancient temples across the Mediterranean, sexuality was absorbed into sacred duty. Greece differed not in outcome, but in presentation. Where others used fear and confinement, Greece used philosophy and aesthetics. The result was the same. Individuals without power learned early that their bodies existed for others. That silence was safer than resistance. That endurance was a virtue. Over time, this conditioning produced generations who no longer recognized coercion as coercion. It simply felt like order. The psychological consequences of such systems are rarely recorded, but they are not difficult to imagine. A boy taught that admiration requires submission may grow into a man who equates dominance with worth. A woman raised to believe her value lies in invisibility may internalize guilt for desires she was never allowed to name. Trauma does not always scream. Often, it settles quietly into behavior, expectation, and belief. These patterns did not remain in Greece. They traveled. Roman elites absorbed Greek education and aesthetics. Later European thinkers inherited Greek philosophy, while filtering out the lives it rested upon. The language of reason survived. The bodies that bore its cost did not. This is why the legacy matters. Not because ancient Greece was uniquely cruel, but because it was uniquely influential. Its ideas shaped how the West learned to talk about virtue, beauty, and civilization. When those ideas were built atop normalized imbalance, the imbalance became harder to see. You might ask whether it is fair to judge the past by modern standards. The answer is not judgment, but recognition. Understanding how power once justified itself helps you recognize when it does so again. The vocabulary changes. The structure often does not. Consider how often harmful traditions are defended as cultural, how frequently authority cloaks itself in education, religion, or art. How easily beauty distracts from suffering. These are not ancient problems. They are recurring ones. History does not repeat itself exactly. It refines its methods. What was once enforced with law and myth may now be enforced with social pressure and ideology. But the underlying question remains the same: who benefits, and who is asked to endure? Ancient Greece forces you to confront an uncomfortable truth. A civilization can be brilliant and brutal at the same time. Progress in one area does not guarantee compassion in another, and admiration, when uncritical, can become complicity. The cost of normalized power is not only paid by its victims, it is paid by the society that mistakes control for order and silence for harmony. Over time, such societies lose the ability to recognize injustice at all, and that loss is never confined to the past. Ancient Greece taught the world how to think, how to argue, how to imagine beauty. But it also taught the world how power hides behind culture, how silence can be mistaken for consent, and how suffering can be reframed as tradition. Remembering this history is not about dismantling admiration. It is about grounding it in truth. Only then can understanding replace myth. If this story challenged what you thought you knew, share it. Question it. Discuss it. Subscribe to continue exploring the histories that were polished, simplified, or deliberately forgotten. And ask yourself one final question: how many systems today still survive because they are called civilized?